Well, thanks for joining. This is another Utah SharePoint and Office 365 user group, so the UTSPUG, or now we're kind of transitioning into the Microsoft User Group Utah, or MUGIT. We're going to put MUGIT hashtags on mugs. I think we're decided.
That sounds good.
Yeah, but this is another one of our virtual events, so thanks for those that are joining live. I'm sure we'll have some other folks jumping in. As always, if you've got questions, you can use the Q&A. We're watching. I'll be monitoring the chat and the Q&A. And Peter, if people are asking questions, you're okay with me interrupting you and posing questions?
Absolutely, bring them on.
All right. And then, of course, the recording will be made available. We'll push it out to YouTube, and we'll have that up probably later today. But from there, just thanks, Peter, for joining us. For those that don't know Peter Carson is the president of user manager, Extranet user manager. Sorry, I was looking at two screens.
No worries.
Manager. He's also the president of the Toronto SharePoint user group and an Office Apps and Services MVP. And welcome, Peter.
Thank you, Christian. Yeah, glad to be here. Thanks for the intro. A little background on my company, Extranet User Manager. It's going to feature fairly heavily in the topic today that we're talking about in terms of structured and unstructured extranets in Office 365. I won't go too heavy on the sales pitch background, but I want to give you a little context. Been working in this space for a long time. Been building extranets on SharePoint on-premises for 10 plus years now. Kind of productized that about 5 years ago, added in Office 365 support about 4 years ago or so, and really building and extending on what Microsoft's doing from an Azure B2B point of view. Customers all around the globe, and let's just dive right into agenda from there. So we've done the introductions. Thank you, Christian. And what we're going to do is start to talk around what we call unstructured extranets. And these are more ad hoc, smaller groups of folks. And I'll get deeper into the definitions from there. Following that, we're going to switch into what we call structured extranets, where you've got larger groups of people that you're sharing with. And typically we see Azure, Active Directory, business to business, or B2B being part of that as well. And we'll talk about how we sit on top of that and extend it with our Extranet User Manager product, and actually take you through a live demo and show you what that's looking like. As Christian mentioned, Q&A is open, so if you've got questions as we're going, feel free to put them out there. I won't be watching myself, but Christian, feel free to jump in where appropriate and interject. I always like to field them as we're going through in context.
Will do.
I usually do a poll, but I don't think we've got a poll set up here today. Get a sense of who's using Office 365, Flow, Power BI, SharePoint on-premises. But let's skip past that and go right into the two styles of extranets that we're going to talk about here today. Now, this is actually not the unstructured or structured. It's really, is this a collaborative extranet where you're going to be collaborating on documents? The people external to your organization are not just going to be consuming that, but they're actually going to be contributing, either uploading or editing things that are in the extranet. This we often see very project focused. You may spin up a project site, for example, in SharePoint Online, Office 365, and invite in external partners to work with you on that project, and they're going to be contributing to that in a collaborative sense. That can be an unstructured or a structured. If you've got a lot of these, maybe you're a consulting company, an engineering company, an architectural firm. We work with all of those where projects are your bread and butter and they're what you do, and you're typically collaborating with externals on there. That can become a structured extranet. You may have a process and guidance around how those are spun up and worked with from there. The other style of extranets is what we call a publishing extranet. And this is very much a one-to-many, where you've got a small number of content authors that need to securely publish content out to a broad audience. And this is typically very structured. You may have some sort of self-registration. There could be an anonymous section to it as well as the secure website. And it's really this one-way push of private content out. We've got financial clients that want to have investor portals where investors can get their financial statements and records and tax slips and things like that. We've got large utility companies that need to share out emergency plans with a broad set of audience. We have charitable organizations that have lots of staff and volunteers that need to be able to access resources, training materials and such from that. So that's really what we're calling the publishing model from that. There may be some feedback from the external users. They may like and comment things, they may upload files, but it's really not collaborative. It's really a secure publishing model. So as we're having discussions with organizations talking about, okay, you want to have an extranet, what are some things that you need to consider for that? We kind of got 5 questions that we're going to walk through that you should be asking yourself or your clients if you're a partner, before we start this project. let's understand what the scope of it is. And the first, obviously, is, well, who's going to be coming in? Is this a members portal for an organization? Is it a customer or vendor portal, suppliers? Maybe we're a charitable organization. We've got volunteers, or we've got a board of directors coming in. Could be government and bringing citizens in, educational, bringing researchers. So there's lots of different scenarios. And any one organization may have several of these. You may have a member portal and a vendor portal and a volunteer portal, that are separate and distinct from each other, but they can all be built on Office 365. The next question typically is, well, do you know who these external users are? If you do, invitation only can work very well. If you've got a small known set of users, you can directly invite them in. That may be managed centrally, or you might delegate it out to different business units or business owners within the organization. Or we'll talk more about things like private registration links, where you may not explicitly know who those people are, but you want to be able to share a link around that can kind of organically bring people into that invitation only site. The flip side is, well, you don't know who those people are. You want them to be able to self-discover. Maybe they come to your public website, click on a link saying, hey, here's our portal, fill out a registration form. Maybe there's some approvals on that. Maybe there's auto approvals or delegation, but that could scale up into hundreds, thousands. We even see tens and hundreds of thousands of external users in those scenarios. Next question is, okay, we've identified who those users are, or they've identified themselves. How are they going to actually sign in? The key part of an extranet is that it's secure. People have to log in. Well, what's that login going to look like? Traditionally, we think of using a username and password. We actually like using email and password. It's easier for people to remember one thing rather than two things. Obviously, things like self-service password resets really important to that, so that the portal is self-service. But maybe your external users already have Office 365. You could bring them in with those accounts, or they have a Microsoft account, Gmail, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter. There's lots of different social ways that users could authenticate to your extranet as well. So let's identify what's appropriate from that point of view. The fourth thing is, well, what sort of interactions? Going back to my earlier slides of a publishing extranet versus a collaborative extranet. What style are you going to be having? Is it just accessing the published content, or do I need to actually update that content and collaborate on specific documents? Do I have team or project sites that I need to come into? Or maybe it's more than SharePoint and I need to be a full-fledged member of an Office 365 group, or I want to be part of a Microsoft Teams team. Those can all be done. External users can be brought into all of those scenarios. And then the last question is, well, what applications will be accessible? We've kind of grown up focused on SharePoint as an extranet, but there's a much broader ecosystem out there. Is it just Office 365 that you need to come into? The base applications like SharePoint Online or OneDrive for Business? Do you need to come into the full groups experience with Teams, Planner, and Yammer? Other 365 apps, maybe you've got an on-premise SharePoint, or you've got some third-party SaaS applications, custom applications on-premise, in the cloud. Again, any one or many of those may be mixed together into one extranet from that point of view. So let's start with the simple case of unstructured extranets and Office 365. So Microsoft's actually done a really good job for this scenario. If you've got ad hoc collaboration that needs to happen, let's say, for example, I wanted to share this PowerPoint presentation note to everybody that was on this call. You've registered to join the webinar. We have your email address. I could actually send you a link to this document. And that could be what's called an anonymous link, where anybody that has the link can see the document. Or it could be a secure link where you need to be the person I've shared it with for you to be able to come in. In either of those scenarios, I can just read it, or I could have edit permissions in there, or I can set expiration dates. So there's actually some really interesting things that they've done from that point of view. So if we come back to my earlier questions, the 5 questions that we went through, if we want to restrict ourselves to just that out-of-the-box external sharing in Office 365, what kind of answers do I need to have answered to that? From a who will be accessing, well, it could be anybody. We don't care from that perspective. But it really needs to be invitation only. There is no self-registration out of the box. You can build it, but that, by definition, is not out of the box. How are those users going to authenticate? Well, they could come in with their Office 365 credentials. They could have a Microsoft account. Now they could actually use a one-time passcode, which is nice. They don't need to set up an account. They just get an email with a code that's valid for 10 minutes. They access it. Next time they need to come in, they get a new code through email, and rinse and repeat from there. Or more recently, they can actually use their Gmail credentials. So you can federate with Google and have them use their Gmail account if they're coming in, say, through Google Docs or such from that point of view. terms of the types of interactions they're going to have, it could be a secure publishing, it could be a full collaborative. Both those scenarios are supported out of the box. Obviously, from an applications point of view, it's really Office 365 only. The external sharing is baked right into 365 itself. That's the application that you're going to be accessing. So if that all fits for the scenario that you're looking at, out of the box actually makes a lot of sense. So what's the first question that often gets asked in that is, well, how do we turn on or turn off the external sharing features? What sort of controls do we have as an organization around that before we just let it loose and let people do whatever they want from that point of view? So there are actually a pretty rich set of admin controls that help you manage external sharing. The first is, defining, well, who can share to external users? Do you want to have everybody in your organization be able to share, or only specific people? So you can define a security group and say, okay, only people that belong to this group are allowed to share with external users. So we don't want everybody in our organization doing this, but there's particular use cases, there's particular people that should be able to do it. Or, you know what, we're just not comfortable with external sharing at all. We don't want it available for everyone. We can just shut it down. So you do have the control to just turn it off completely if you want to. And then you have a decision, well, you've decided who's going to share. Now, who are they going to share with? Are they allowed to share with anybody they want to? Just authenticated users? Is there specific domains that you want to whitelist or blacklist? Or again, nobody. I mean, you can see here there's a pattern. You can have it as open or locked down, basically turned off as you'd like from that point of view. So we've talked about who can share, who can they share with. The next is, what are they allowed to share? Can they share anything they want, or is there only specific sites? Maybe there's private internal sites, an internal HR team site with sensitive information in it. We don't want to share that site at all. Or you could actually use some of the tagging on content to say, okay, let's allow sharing of any content that's not tagged as sensitive. And data loss protection, features like that in Office 365 can be used to drive that definition of what sensitive content is. And then how those external shareable links are going to be used. Are they there by default? They're enabled, but not the default choice when you share a link. Is there a mandatory expiration date to say, when I share this, I can only share it for, say, up to 30 days, and then it has to expire from there? Can we block editable links, so I can share a document for people to see, but they can't actually update it? Or again, I want to disable it from that point of view. So these are all decisions you need to make as an IT administrator of Office 365. From a governance point of view, what does the organization want in terms of the rules around external sharing? And it's actually configured in 3 different places. So there's a spot in the Office 365 admin where you have to say, yes, I want to allow external sharing globally for the tenant. Then you need to go into SharePoint itself, not an individual site, but the overall SharePoint admin, and say, yes, these are the rules that I want to apply from an external sharing point of view at the SharePoint tenant level. And then within each site collection itself, you can further define it from there. And the way that it works is the least privilege of any one of these 3 is what applies. So if you say, well, at the site collection and at the SharePoint level, I'm allowed to share, but I turn it off at the Office 365 point of view, that trumps everything and nobody can share anything anywhere. But if you turn it on at the Office 365 level, and you turn it on in a particular site and off in another site, it means that one site will allow sharing and the other one won't. Now you can do it through the admin GUI, or if you're a PowerShell nerd, you can write some PowerShell to do this as well. So let's actually look at a couple of those scenarios. And the first is a very simple scenario where I'm just sending some sales material to a customer. And I'd rather not send them as attachment. I mean, honestly, that's the default behavior for most people. I need to share a document with somebody externally. I'm going to attach it to an email, hit send, and it's shared. And that's really not a good way to share things out. You've lost control of that attachment as soon as you've sent it. If you decide, wait a minute, I need to update it, or we need to collaborate on it, we start getting emails back and forth, and it quickly gets out of hand, particularly if it's a larger group. If it's one person, it's not so bad. If it's half a dozen people and they each start changing it, that gets quickly out of control. So the idea of SharePoint is, well, let's have a single version of the truth, have that document in a portal, and we'll share a link to that. In this scenario here, we're actually not putting any security on it. If they have the link, they're able to access the document. Now that scares most security folks and governance. They say, well, that's terrible. It's actually no worse and actually better than just attaching a document to an email. In this scenario, or actually in both scenarios, you have to receive the email in order to interact with the document. But in this scenario, we can time bomb that link, so it expires after a particular time. We can revoke it if there was a mistake made there. Once you attach a document, you can't actually pull that back from an email point of view. So this is actually just as simple as email attachments, and actually more secure, even though it feels that it's not. So when I come through the UI, and I'll show you a demo a little later as we go through this, I basically say, hey, I want to share this item with anyone. I define whether I allow editing or not, what the expiration date is on it, apply it, copy it, and whoever I give it to, yes, those people can forward it to other people. So there's a lack of control from that point of view. But still, you need to be in that inner circle to have received that email to be able to access that document. Now, if we want to up the game from a security point of view and say, well, I'm not comfortable with that. I don't want somebody to be able to forward that email to somebody else, and that person that I never invited myself now has access to the document, then what we want is a secure link. And here, you define the people that the link is going to work for. And they need to prove who they are before they're able to use that link. So we come through the UI here, and instead of saying anyone, I say specific people, and I choose those people. They get a link that just works for them. And they need to prove they're the intended recipient. There's a couple ways that happen. If you, for example, shared it with me, I'm an Office 365 user already. I could use my Office 365 credentials. In fact, I'd probably already be signed into my own tenant, and I would just click the link and open the document, and away it goes. So it's very simple from that point of view. If I don't have Office 365, Microsoft knows that based on my email address, and it'll send me a code. So that one-time passcode idea, where I receive the code in my email, I paste it into the login form, then I have access to the document. But I proved that I had access to that email address that it was invited by because I needed to receive that code before I could get into the document. So it is secure from that point of view. And then you can also do external sharing at the site level as well to say, well, I don't want to share a specific document or folder. I want to share the entire site. That's managed through regular SharePoint permissions, but you can then invite the users in through there. And we'll talk in a minute about some of the announcements from Microsoft, how they've kind of brought some of the B2B functionality from Azure AD into the external sharing in this scenario and actually made that work easier from that point of view. So let's take a minute and do a quick demo here. So let me come over to my browser. And I've got a document library with a couple of sample documents in it here. So let's say one of these documents, say the communication plan, I want to share it with some folks. So I can click on that particular document, and we'll see we've got a share and a copy link up in the ribbon here. The reality is I can choose either of those, because whichever I choose, I can kind of go down the other path from there. But let's start with the share link here. You can define what the default behavior is that comes up. We've set the default to say, well, you need to be part of Envision IT in order to use that link. So basically, the default is it's not sharing with somebody externally. But let's say we want to do it with anyone with that link. So these are the options that we're showing. We set it to default to allow editing. You flip it the other way to say, well, no, you need to check the checkbox if you want to through there. We can set an expiration date to say, hey, this is only valid until Friday. We can actually set a password if we want. I'm not keen on this feature because now you've got to communicate that password to somebody, probably through email, which isn't very secure. So it's not great from that point of view. This next one here is an interesting one where you can actually block the download. And what this does is it allows the user to view that document through the browser, but they can't open it in the full app, they can't download it, they can't save it. So really it gives them view-only access to it. So they can't download it and forward it to somebody else from there. It's an interesting feature they added about a year ago. So I can apply that. I can specify somebody in here with an email address and go ahead and send that, and Microsoft will actually send that email on my behalf. What I generally do, though, is I hit this copy link here. It creates a shareable link that I then copy into an email because I'm probably going to give some more context to why I'm sharing that particular document with that user. So I copy it out, and away it goes from there. Now, let's say there was a budget that went with that as well. It's a little more sensitive. The communication plan, okay, I'm comfortable sharing that with an anonymous link, but the budget, I want to make sure only the right people have access to that. So if I again follow that same path, come through share, and instead of anyone, I choose the specific people here, it's then going to ask me for the addresses for that people. So let's say I'm not actually in my normal tenant here, I'm in my demo tenant. I can put in peter@envisionit.com, which is my regular Office 365 account. And again, I have the choice of letting Microsoft send that email or go ahead and copy the link from there, paste it into my own email, give some context, and go from there. Now, if we look on the information panel over here, let's go back to the communication plan, for example. We can see here there's actually a note on the account saying, hey, this item is being shared with guests. So I know that it's been externally shared. And one of the announcements I'll talk about in a minute is some reporting and improvements Microsoft's done to make that even easier from that point of view. So I click on Manage Access, excuse me. I have the ability to say, you know what, I'm done sharing. I know it's not Friday, but I want to lock it down. I want to copy that link for somebody else. I want to modify it as to whether it can be edited or not. I want to actually just remove it altogether. So I can remove that link. And even though I shared it out with people, it's no longer shared. You know, it doesn't matter when you get that link. When you click on it now, after I've removed it, it's dead. It doesn't work anymore from that point of view. So it does give you greater control around that. And you can do the same thing on the shared with specific people as well. So let's flip back to the presentation. So I actually did a interview with Mark Cashman and Stephen Rice, two of the folks from the product team that are very focused on the external sharing side of things. So there's a link in the deck. We're going to be sharing this deck out. You can review that video, but I've got a couple of the highlights that I want to go through here as well. You know, one of the things that I thought was really cool was this request files concept. So sometimes you don't want to share documents with people. You want to get documents from people. And you don't want them to email attach it to you, either from a security point of view or often from a file size point of view. You know, if you've got somebody that has a 100 gig database backup that they need to send to you, that's obviously not going to go through an email attachment. Actually, that was a bad example because bigger than 15 gigs is not going to go through either. But let's say 1 gig, 2 gig, like too big to send as an email attachment. You can request those files. And what it'll do is it'll create a link that people can then use to upload the files. And the way that that link works is the uploaders only see their own content. So maybe I've shared this out with a group of 20 people saying, hey, drop your submissions for this event that we're planning. You know, maybe you've got a speaking topic that you want to upload into there. They all see what they've uploaded, but they don't see each other's from there. And that same link can be used for all the uploaders. The person that's made the request obviously sees the folder and sees all the submissions from there. So it's a neat concept. OneDrive sharing in Microsoft Teams. So that sharing dialog that I showed you in the SharePoint Online window, that's now coming to Teams as well. So if I've got a document, which under the hood is stored in SharePoint, but if I want to interact with it through the Teams interface and then share it, I get the exact same experience. And this is Microsoft's goal, regardless of where you are. In fact, if you use the OneDrive for Business sync client and you've got sync to local files and you right-click on them to share them, you get the same dialog coming up there as well. So it's a nice user experience. It's very consistent across all the different ways you interact with files in SharePoint Online. I mentioned deeper integration with Azure AD B2B. So if you invite users into the site as a whole, they can now use the one-time passcode feature, not just for a document or a folder, but for the site as a whole. You can even utilize the premium Azure AD functionality. So maybe you've got things like multi-factor authentication that you want to, say, send a text to their SMS device, like their phone, as part of them coming in. You can actually light that up. It is a premium feature. There's some licensing around that we'll talk about, but that's all possible to do now as well. And then I mentioned reporting. There's some enhanced reports. They don't have a visual component to it, but basically you now have the ability to export a CSV file of all the sharing details. You can pull it into Power BI, you can pull it into Excel, build your own sharing dashboards from there. So that's nice to see. Expiring external access. So site administrators can define the expiry terms. Site administrators can then extend that for particular requirements if need be from there. So those are some of the things from the SharePoint conference back in May a couple months ago. So let's flip gears and talk about structured extranets. You know, in a structured extranet, we're typically talking about hundreds, thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of external users. You know, and while the out-of-the-box external sharing features are great, you're not going to, you know, click 1,000 times and load email addresses in to invite somebody into a document or to a site when you get to that sort of scale. You need something more to give some structure and some governance to that. You know, and again, the different groups of external users could be that full list that we were talking about earlier. But there may be many different business owners as well. So within your organization, you may have a number of lines of business, each with their external sharing needs from that point of view. You know, I've done a lot of work with a consulting engineering company. They've got offices across Canada. We're located in Canada. And each of those offices are somewhat autonomous. They want to be able to manage their own external sharing without having to go to a central IT resource to manage that from that point of view. So typically when we're talking about Office 365 and structured extranets, Azure AD B2B becomes part of the mix there. Stands for business to business, and it's really a way to allow external users to access not just Office 365, really any system exposed through Azure AD. So it could be your own custom application, it could be a third-party SaaS application. If it supports OpenID Connect, which Azure AD supports, you can actually wire that together. So it is more broad than just Office 365. But the key thing is that if external users come in through Azure AD B2B and they go into SharePoint Online specifically, completely free. So there's no licensing required for those external users. In fact, I should tweak that bullet. It's not actually all of Office 365. Things like Power BI has its own licensing. We're still working through some of the details on that. But from a SharePoint Online point of view, no concerns. There's a lot of confusion in the market around that because there is this 1-to-5 licensing ratio that gets talked about where for every user that you've got licensed on-premise for Azure AD, you can have 5 external users come in and use those features. But the reality is if you're just using the Azure AD free features that come with your Office 365 subscription, there's no limit on those, and you can have as many external users as you want. Really only matters when you bring in the premium features like conditional access or multi-factor authentication, that 1-to-5 licensing ratio comes in. So really, at the end of the day, if you don't need those premium features, you can invite as many external users as you like, regardless of how many subscribing users you have, and have no additional cost for that. So what is the user experience like that? What is the onboarding experience when somebody gets invited in through Azure AD B2B? It's actually fairly similar to what we were seeing with the out-of-the-box external sharing in Office 365. If that external user already has their own Office 365 account, they're going to log in with that. In fact, if they have a browser open and they're already logged into their own Office 365, they're not even going to see a login. It'll just single sign on into your tenant and works very seamlessly from that point of view. Same is true if they have a Microsoft account. If they don't have an Azure AD account, you can light up the preview feature, which we strongly recommend you do, to allow one-time passcodes. And this eliminates all the past confusion where people had to create Azure AD accounts and set passwords or create Microsoft accounts. It got very confusing for external users. They've eliminated all that friction. And so you know what? Forget about creating an account. We're just going to send you a 10-minute one-time passcode. Use it, sign in. Your session is valid for the day. If you close your browser, you need to sign back in. We'll send you a new code, repeat from there. So it's very simple. And then more recently, they've added the Google Federation. Now, we found in our testing that it's not a complete Google Federation. So if they have say they're a Google Docs and Gmail corporate users and they've got their own domain federated. So imagine peter@envisionit.com was actually hosted by Google. I wouldn't be able to use that through the federation. But if I'm using a Gmail email address, that goes through fine from that point of view. Not sure if they're planning on providing the broader G Suite support there. This is a first pass and it is still preview, but it's an interesting start from that point of view. So that's the out-of-the-box experience. So the question we always get asked is, well, why do I need Extranet User Manager? What does it do? Does it replace what Azure AD B2B does? No, it absolutely does not. It sits on top of. So let's come back and talk about some of the challenges to using just pure out-of-the-box Azure AD B2B. The external sharing that I showed you at the beginning, that's not B2B, that's the out-of-the-box Office 365 features. It's fantastic for small scale, but as you scale that up, it doesn't scale well from that point of view. The challenge with B2B is it's not very user-friendly. You need to use the Azure portal to invite people in. The delegation is sort of an all or nothing. If you're delegated, then you have access to all the guest users. So having silos and isolation between different lines of business is difficult to do from that point of view. There's no self-registration, no integration to other line of business systems. You can build both of those things yourself, but again, it's no longer out of the box. Same thing with on-premises AD. If you've got on-premises system you want to authenticate as part of that, you need that integration there. So what Extranet User Manager does is it solves a lot of those challenges. It provides the self-registration, the profile management, the easy delegation down to the business. They use our product to create users and create groups, and under the hood, we're using the Graph API in Azure AD to actually create those users and groups in Azure AD. We manage the invitations. Now, Azure AD still manages the login process. You have to go through the Microsoft login. You can brand that, and we'll show you that in a minute. But we manage the group membership that you then apply permissions to from there. So we don't do the permissions actually into SharePoint Online. We just set up the group memberships, and then it's up to you to use standard SharePoint best practices to apply permissions to those groups.
Hey, Peter, quick question. Greg is asking, similar to Microsoft and Office 365 accounts, does federation with Google G Suite accounts only mean G Suite accounts, so not Gmail, or all Google accounts?
It's actually the reverse. So it's only Gmail accounts we found and not G Suite accounts. We need to tweak that messaging a little bit. So if your email address ends in gmail.com, then the federation works for you. If you've got your own corporate email registered with Google, that part doesn't get recognized as federation just yet. So, when to use one or the other? If we're talking about external sharing, if we're just sharing with a few people, like I mentioned, the example of me sharing this PowerPoint presentation with this group, the external sharing actually works great. And we recommend it all the time in scenarios like that. We have potential clients call us and say, hey, we're interested in your product. We have a board of directors with 12 people on it that we'd like to share a board site with. And we say, you know what? We can show you how to do that without our product. We're not trying to make a sale where it doesn't make sense. External sharing absolutely makes sense in certain scenarios. Co-authoring on a small number of individual documents, you're the sole administrator of the permissions, and you want to avoid things like Dropbox or Box or other shadow IT within the organization and say, well, we're already using Office 365, let's use those features from that point of view. But when it gets bigger, you've got lots of people, you've got self-service requirements, delegation, maybe you've got site provisioning, which is actually our next webinar topic that we're going to be talking about, or other line of business systems you want to integrate with. That is where it makes sense to use Extranet User Manager in conjunction with Azure AD B2B. So it's not an either or, we very much work together with Microsoft from that point of view. So there's three main scenarios that I want to take you through on the structured external sharing scenario. The first is invitation only. So it's similar to the out of the box, where the business owner knows who they're going to invite. They're going to do direct one of invitations, or a bit of an enhancement from that. They've got, say, an Excel file of 100 or 1,000 external users they want to bring in. They can bulk import that in. The next is private registration. This is an interesting scenario. So the business owner knows someone who knows who to invite. So it's kind of a second degree of separation. You don't know all the people that need to come in, but you need enough of them, and you can let them then invite other people in from there. So kind of like the anonymous sharing links, the private registration link can be shared around. Anybody that receives it can then register on the site. You can still have approvals on that. Maybe you want to have auto approvals on email domains, so anybody from that organization just comes right in. There's a lot of different scenarios you can go through that. And then the public registration scenario is, hey, anybody can find this, discover it, and register. And again, we may or may not want to have approvals on that. We may or may not want to have auto approvals as well. So let's dive a little deeper into the invitation only scenario. So we've got a SharePoint framework web part we're going to be showing you in a minute that actually sits on the SharePoint site that allows you to invite users into that site directly from within the site. So it's a nice user experience there. Or we have our full admin console. It's security trimmed down, so you can have folks that just have the rights to add users to their groups. They could invite people in through there as well. So either there's going to be a one of, I've typed in the email address, and they're going to get invited into the portal from there. Or as I mentioned, maybe I've got an Excel spreadsheet with a bunch of people. It'll generate all the welcome emails, send those out, put them in the appropriate group so they can then access the appropriate site in Office 365. Now the private registration is a little bit different. So you can retrieve the private registration link either from that web part in the SharePoint site or from the admin console. We provide it through both of those. But it's up to you to distribute that through email to whoever you choose to. And it's this idea that you give it to two friends and they give it to two friends and so on, and it gets passed around to a broader group of users, which is actually what you want. You don't know who all those people are, but you know who some of the connectors are. You can reach out to them and say, hey, connect us with the people that you know so that they can come into the site. Anybody that receives that private registration link then gets directed through that link to a sign-up page that kind of explains, well, this is the group that you've been invited to, this is why, what it's about. If you agree with that and you want to join it, click the button to join the group. The first thing you have to do is create an account on the Extranet. And we make this very seamless for the end user. We ask them, hey, do you already have Office 365? or do you want to use your email? Let's assume they want to use their email. They enter their email address, and we can identify whether they already have an account on our Extranet or not. If they do, we'll just continue on the sign-in process, but here they don't. Let's go through the registration process. And we're capturing a fairly minimal set of data here, but these forms are customizable. If you've got different fields that you want to capture, you can absolutely do that. So they've gone through that whole registration process. We often use Microsoft Flow. So I'll show you some examples, but we support both triggers and actions with Extranet User Manager in Flow. So you could say, okay, once they've registered, how does that approval process work? Does it need to route it to different people depending on the answers they made on the registration or the group that they're going into? All of that can be built as part of the flow. And ultimately, once it's approved, they get added to the group. They now have access to Office 365 from there. The public registration is very much the same scenario, except the link is not distributed through email. You're going to publish it up on a website somewhere where people can discover it, click on it, go through that same registration, go through the same flow, and ultimately come into Office 365 from there. All right, we can take a quick pause for a sip here. Christian, any additional questions before we move into demo mode?
Nothing so far.
Okay.
Yeah, so again, it just use the Q&A module, and we'll try and get to those as quickly as possible.
Awesome.
Right.
So the demo scenario that we're going to go through here is we're going to use a demo Office 365 tenant that we've set up, eondemo.sharepoint.com. And we have an installation of Extranet User Manager associated with that. It's built on top of Azure AD B2B, and they're going to authenticate through the Azure AD login form. We're going to manage those users through Extranet User Manager. So let's actually start at the second link here, the landing link. Let me come back to my sites. Or actually, you know what? I'm going to come to the SharePoint landing page. So I'm actually signed into Office 365 as a regular user right now, not as an external user. And this is the landing page that we direct everybody to who has Extranet accounts. And what we have is, it's our site lists web part, which is part of our open source site provisioning solution that I'm going to be talking about in our next webinar, that's showing me the sites that are available to me on this tenant. And basically the way that it works is there's a sites list behind the scenes that you can security trim down to say, okay, depending on what groups you belong to, you're going to see different sites available to you. And basically you've got one URL to give to people, and it directs them into whatever sites they have access to. And we've set up 4 demo scenarios here. We've got 2 private groups, one with approval and one without. And we have 2 public groups, one with approval and one without, that we can go in from there. So let's actually look at it from an external point of view. So what I'm going to do is open up an incognito window, and I'm going to go to our landing site. So this is not Office 365. This is part of the Extranet User Manager product. And this site, while it's branded for Extranet User Manager, is intended to be branded for your organization. So you can completely take over the look and feel and user experience in here, and it's a starting point that you build on from there. So let's say we want to start exploring through here. I'm currently not signed into the site. So I only see the 2 public groups here, because those are the only ones that are available. I'd need to have a link for one of the private groups to be able to go in through there. And let's say I want to do a public group with approval sign up. So I can click on that particular group, and I come to this page here. We've got some copy that explains what the group is, why you'd want to come in. All of that's edited and managed through Extranet User Manager. So I'll show you in a minute that side of the interface. And this is actually the same style of landing page you come to with a private registration link. You just can't discover it. You have to have the link to come straight here, and it would then explain what that private group is about. So let's say we want to join that group. So I have to sign in. I may or may not have an account yet. I'm going to choose email as my path through here. I'm going to use a dummy email address that we have access to just to illustrate a brand new user coming in through here. So I'm going to go ahead and continue. We've recognized, hey, I haven't seen this user before. And as I mentioned, these fields are fully customizable in terms of what you want to capture from registration process. Often we integrate this into backend, Dynamic CRM or Salesforce as well from a CRM tracking point of view. Let's go ahead and register that user. So while that's coming up, let me go over to my email. So there's a couple of emails that are going to happen through here. So the first is I need to actually complete the sign-in process here. And this is actually using the one-time passcode from Microsoft that I was talking about. So we're actually on login.microsoftonline.com. So we're no longer on our site, but you can see that we've applied our branding to this, which is something you can do with Azure AD. So I want to go ahead and send the code. What it's doing is it's emailing me that one-time passcode that I can use to sign into the site. So we'll give it a second for that email to come up. There we go. So let me pull that over onto this screen so we can see it. So this is an email generated from Microsoft. Again, you have a little bit of control over the look and feel of this email, but the important thing here is this account verification code. So I'm going to copy that code and paste it in here. And it acts like a one-time password, basically. I need to consent because this is the first time I've been coming in to Office 365. So I go ahead and accept that. So that was a Microsoft consent from an Azure AD point of view, and then we're back to our site now. So we're now completing the sign-in process. We have the ability to put up our own disclaimer page that you can edit the copy on it. You don't have to use that, but if you want to track acceptance of a disclaimer, you can make that part of your process. We'll go ahead and enter the site. And it's come back to a confirmation page to say, hey, your request to join the group has been submitted. Now, this one I chose an approval one, so it actually needs to go through that approval process. So there's a couple ways that approval can happen. So if we come back to our authenticated side, and let me come into our main console. So we haven't seen this part of Extranet User Manager yet. This is where I manage users and groups, and I set the system up as a whole. I'm logged in as what's called a configuration editor, so I see everything in here. I could be just a group owner, in which case I'd just be able to manage users, or a group editor where I'd be able to do users and groups. So you can lock down how much you want to delegate to your business owners through this. Let's say we want to search a user through here. I'll search for Peter. Got a bunch of test accounts I've been using. There's the Peter Webinar 4 that we're looking at. Let's go ahead and edit that user. So I can see all the profile details that were entered when they registered, and I see that there's a membership request here. So they're not actually in this particular group yet because they're waiting for my approval. So if I click on that to select it and say approve the selected, I can put some comments in here, and that'll go in the email to the person that's requested to join this group. It's updated it, and now I'm a member of that group. Now you'll notice here that I'm also a member of this all B2B users. And the way that happened was actually through a flow workflow. So let's take a little side tour and talk about the flow integration for a minute. So if I go into my flows, we've got this one here, add new users to all B2B users EUM group. And the reason that we're doing this is that in the past, we can see this ran just 3 minutes ago. In the past, there was an all users group that you could use in SharePoint Online, and you could secure parts of your system, like, for example, this landing site to allow read-only access to all users. That group is now called all users except external, and there's no way to allow those external users by default to be in that group. So what we do is we create a little flow here that says, hey, when a new user is created in Extranet User Manager, we can see there's our pwebinar 4 at eum.co that got created. Add them to the all B2B users. So we have a custom connector for Flow that lets you do a lot of different things. You can have triggers when something happens in Extranet User Manager, and you can have actions. This particular action says add this user to that all B2B users, which is why when we're back here, we see that they're in that group. And just hopefully not confusing you too much, but if I come back to my site permissions on this site here, we'll see that we've given that all B2B users read access to this site, because we want all the Extranet users to be able to get into this SharePoint Online site. So that's how we've wired that together. Okay, so let's come back to our external user. So we're back in our incognito window. I actually need to close this one down. There's still a few challenges with B2B native that we're working through. One of them is that for your new groups to be recognized, you need to sign back in as the user, because they actually get assigned as part of the login process. We've got some new links we built that simplify that. We just haven't applied it to this demo tenant just yet. So I'm going to go ahead and close that, open up a new incognito window, and let's go right to our SharePoint landing site. Now, the other challenge that we're still working through with Microsoft is there's timing delays behind the scenes between Office 365 and Azure AD. So even though I've added that user to the all B2B users, it can take 10 or 15 minutes before that user is able to log in and successfully authenticate into SharePoint Online. So I'm actually going to use one of the accounts that I set up earlier in my dry run. We'll come back to this account and prove that it does work at the end of the webinar once we've gone through that time. So I need to go through my sign-in again. I need a new token coming through. So let's just give a second for Microsoft to send it. There we are. Copy that verification code. And I can now sign in. Now, I'm actually coming to the SharePoint Online tenant, and I'm going to that landing site that I was showing you before that has all B2B users has access to it. So I have access to the site, but now when we look at the site, we see that I've only got one group or one site showing up in the list here. If I flip back to my other browser tab and I come in here, you'll see that there's actually 4 sites there, but since I'm not a member of the other groups, I don't actually see those. So it's a nice way to security trim that down to say, okay, come to this site here, and it'll direct you to the sites that you have access to. So I can go ahead and click on that site, and it's taking me to that SharePoint Online site that I'm a member of. Now, this is the SharePoint Framework web part that I was talking about earlier that allows you to interact with Extranet User Manager right within the SharePoint site. Now, remember, I'm signed in as one of the external users. I'm not a site owner. I shouldn't be able to invite new people to the site. So the SharePoint Framework web part actually trims that down to say, okay, I'm only going to let you do certain things. You know, I could select all the users here and say I want to send an email to all those users, whom I can go ahead and do that. You know, we could even shut down that functionality if you don't want people to be able to do that. It's actually a useful feature for the team members to be able to communicate with each other. Or if I want to share this out with somebody and say, hey, go to this link to register to be able to join this site, you know, there's an easy way for me to come here and get that registration link. But let's actually come back to the site owner, and let's go into that same public group with approval site that we're in from their context. Now that SharePoint Framework web part comes up. It shows me all the same people in here, but I've got a bunch more things in the toolbar here. You know, if there's a one-of person that I want to add in to that site, I can just bang their email address in and invite them in, and away they go. I can select a particular user like that Peter Webinar 4 that we just created and actually edit them, update their name, their telephone, and again, these fields are customizable depending on what profile you want to keep on those external users. I could remove that user to say, you know what, I don't want them in my group anymore. I can do the same email functionality. I can get the registration link, or I can actually edit the group as a whole. What that does is it jumps me over to Extranet User Manager. Oops, I left that one idle for too long. Let's go back in there. Let me actually click that link again. It'll be easier. Oh, that's not working for me. I'll just pull it up through the search interface. So it was the public with approval. There we go. Okay, so what it should do is link me over to here. We got to see what's going on from an authentication point of view there. And I'm able to define all the properties around that group. You know, what's the name of the group that we see from a security point of view? What's the display name that shows up on the end user pages? There's a group ID, a status. If people are joining this group, do we want approval to happen or not? And if so, who gets those approval emails? Is it available for registration? What's the URL for registration? Can I copy that? And what's the SharePoint Online site that's associated with it? Is it publicly available? Well, this one is. That's turned on. If I turn that off, then it wouldn't show in that public list. And even the content that we were showing on that page, from a summary and a description before I sign up, that's all defined in through here. And these are all full WYSIWYG editors. So if you want to add formatting, hyperlinks, images, you can do all that and create a very rich interface to that. So that's all in terms of defining the group itself. And then down here, we can see who the owners, members, and membership requests are. Peter Webinar 4 is in here already now. It was in the membership requests, excuse me, previously before I approved it. And this owners concept is important for delegation. If there's people within your organization, or even maybe external people that you want to delegate and allow to manage the membership of the group, you make them an owner. They're then able to use this page to add members, to approve requests. It also drives the functionality that we see in the SharePoint Framework web part in terms of what they're allowed to do. If they're an owner, that's what defines getting the ad edit, remove all those user management features within the SharePoint Framework web part. So it all ties together quite nicely. The idea being that this site gets created for a business owner, and all they need to do is come in here and start inviting users, sending registration links, importing Excels, sharing out a public link if required, approving those, and those people can then come in and interact from there. What they can do in SharePoint is completely up to you. You use the standard SharePoint permissions model to apply whatever appropriate permissions are through there. In our scenario here, what we've done is just given read access to the site. So I can come through the SharePoint interface, but you see the gear doesn't give me a lot of detail here. I can't edit documents, delete documents, do anything from an administrative point of view because I only have reader access in. And you could have multiple groups associated with one site. We have the ability here to actually create a new Extranet user manager group through here. Typically what we'd see happen in that scenario, if you turn that on, is you would have a flow workflow behind that. Maybe it needs to create a new folder in the documents, or maybe it needs to create a whole new document library, set up permissions around that. It's up to you from an information architecture point of view, how that behavior should happen. You have the flexibility to build that however you want through there. So that's sort of a quick demo walkthrough from that point of view. Let's see if the demo gods are going to cooperate with me here. Let's start a new incognito window here. We'll go to the SharePoint landing page. We'll use that account that we just created. Just have to wait a second for Microsoft to send us that code. Sometimes quicker than others. There we go. So we've got our account verification code. Plug that in. Completes the login. Takes me to the SharePoint Online landing site. Oh, it kind of half worked for me. Okay, so we're still having a little permissions issues there. It let me into the site itself, but it didn't let me into the target site that we wanted to go through there. So we still got a little bit of work from a B2B point of view. That's not actually us. That's moving pieces behind the scenes in Office 365 that Microsoft's controlling, and a lot of that is not synchronous. It doesn't necessarily happen right away from that perspective. Okay, let's come back to our deck. So we walked through our scenarios there. Let's talk a bit about licensing. We've talked about the product here. What does it cost to actually purchase the product? There's 3 flavors to it. There's a light, a standard, and enterprise edition. Feature-wise, they're exactly the same. There's no differences there other than as you federate with multiple applications. Let's say you've got Office 365 and some other SaaS applications you want to make part of the mix. That does require the enterprise edition. Otherwise, it's really just the number of users that you're bringing in. We don't have a per user per month cost. It's strictly on buckets. So either light, less than 250 users, standard 250 to 5,000, or enterprise unlimited from there for that monthly cost from there. There's an onboarding cost as well. There's often additional branding and customizations that we do as part of the projects. We work with partners on that as well. That's all part of the overall project cost. We're getting fairly tight on time here. I'm going to go pretty quickly through this part here. We've already shown you the SharePoint Framework web part and the admin console. We didn't take you into the branding. We've got lots of client examples of nice branding to customize from that point of view. Talked about the delegation. The self-registration we went through, again, that self-registration can get very involved. This was one we did for March of Dimes for stroke survivors. It was a multi-step registration process. So again, we can get quite sophisticated there. We don't just work with Office 365, SharePoint on-premises 2010 to 2019, other applications that understand either OpenID Connect, WS Federation, or SAML2. We support all those. Fully adaptive. I didn't show you any of the mobile, but we use Bootstrap, so it works well from a smartphone, tablet, or desktop point of view. You can host it in Azure, or you can put it into your own data center, up to you. We're finding Azure App Service is really the preferred way to go. It's well managed by Microsoft and simplifies things for you. And then the Flow integration we're really excited about. This is a fairly new addition this year to Extranet User Manager that we're actually still extending and adding on to, but the possibilities are endless in terms of what you can do from that point of view. In terms of upcoming events, we've got a follow-on webinar coming on September 10th. I alluded to a little bit. I've got a couple more slides that'll give more detail on the Microsoft Teams, Office 365 groups, and SharePoint sites provisioning. And then we will be down at Microsoft Ignite on November 4th to 8th down in Orlando, Florida. We'll have more webinars coming. We just don't have them booked on the schedule just as of yet. So on the September 10th one, it actually dovetails really nicely into what I was just showing you. The idea is that we want some governance around the provisioning of new teams, new Office 365 groups, new SharePoint sites. So how does that work? Well, I already mentioned we have a SharePoint list that drives the presentation of what sites you have access to, and it actually also is there to support the request process. So basically, we have a list that new entries get added to say, hey, I'd like a new site, I'd like a new Office 365 group, I'd like a new Microsoft team, and Flow becomes a key part of that to say when new requests are triggered, go through a Flow approval workflow. We have a SharePoint framework web part that we built, that we've open sourced as part of the solution. That allows you to enter those requests, the approval workflow that runs from there. Excuse me. And then what it does is Flow calls out to Azure Automation, and we use, built a lot on the PNP open source from Microsoft, the provisioning scripts. We have some PowerShell scripts that you can customize that actually create the SharePoint site, they create the Microsoft team, they can wire into Extranet User Manager to create the groups there, they wire it all together. We've even added in features around Microsoft Planner, OneNote, Stream, so we're really expanding the feature set of what can be done with this solution. It's a baseline that we use in all of our client engagements, but as I mentioned, we make it available open source as well. You can build on it from your own perspective there too. Some of the key technologies involved in there. All the source code is up on GitHub, so the link is there. As I mentioned, we'll share the deck out with you. We do have a detailed white paper as well with step-by-step instructions. I just went through with a European partner recently that was going through those instructions, had some questions. We're going to do some tweaks to it. So always open to feedback as well. If you're working through it and you're not clear on all the steps in there, by all means, reach out to us. We'd love to make that better for everybody, and it's a continually improving solution from there. Well, Christian, thank you for facilitating this. It's been fun.
Yeah, no, thanks for joining us again, Peter. And we can hang on here for a couple more minutes if there's any other questions. But otherwise, thanks for joining. And you can always reach out. Of course, Peter's accessible. Everybody knows how to find me. Drop me an email as well if there are any other follow-up questions, and I'll make sure to connect you.
Great. Thanks, everybody, and have a great rest of your day.